and welcome to another Scots Whay podcast. And today I'm talking to Carina Birrell, the producer of Harry Birrell Films of Love and War. Hello, Carina.
Hello.
And keen listeners will spot a connection there, but could you tell us about your relationship with Harry and then therefore the film?
So Harry was my grandfather, my dad's father, and he passed away when I was only 8 years old, so I didn't really have the opportunity to get to know him very well in my own lifetime. But I was aware that he'd spent a lot of his life amateurly recording film and keeping diaries and photo albums and documenting lots of things that happened to him in his life. So as I became increasingly aware of quite what his archive contained, I became more and more motivated to want to do something with it. Yeah,
because this is no normal life, as you can see from the footage, and it's incredible that a family, has this footage of someone from it. It's astonishing to see. So how did the film come about? Because you had a lot of footage.
Yes, there was a lot of footage. The film really came about because I trained as an actor, and then I started segueing a bit into producing as well. And the more people I got to know in the industry, and the more I kind of got to understand really how the industry worked a bit, I became more and more interested in sort of testing whether there was any value really to an audience outside of the family wanting to see some of the stuff that Harry had done, given that I'd only actually seen really a sort of fraction of the films that he'd made as a child. We'd been able to see some stuff that he'd had transferred onto Betamax and onto VHS.
Right.
So anyway, I started kind of talking to people about the idea. I said, look, my granddad had filmed this kind of extraordinary amount of stuff. I haven't seen a lot of it. I know there's a lot of film there. Do you think there'd be any value in this? And the more people I spoke to, the more sort of positive responses I got that, I think this is quite a unique thing that you're sitting on here. And Harry donated quite a lot of his films, 11 or so titles of short films to the Scottish Screen Archive. And my father was the signature for that. And the interest and the kind of queries wanting to use bits of Harry's film started to ramp up a bit, and I felt that there was this increasing appetite for archive and for exploring whether amateur or professionally made film that had been never seen before, and particularly stuff as early as Harry had shot colour film in the 30s and footage of the war in the 40s and things. I really just started exploring the idea of it, and was very, very aware that it would take the right team of people to capture the sort of sensitivity and to the right sensitivity to make it a film that would do Harry's work justice. So that was the sort of prime concern at the start of the process.
Because, there's so many interesting aspects to this. One, I think I'm right saying he was 10 when he got his first camera.
Yeah.
Which is quite something.
Quite something, yeah. And I think it was just a case of, like his grandparents had bought themselves a camera, and they were taking it on holiday a bit and thought, you know what, we actually have no idea how to use this. We're not making the most of it. And they could see that Harry had quite a keenness towards getting his hands on the camera, and so they gifted it to him, and they said, look, we're not getting the most out of this camera. You have it. He was given it as a gift, and then I think from that day onwards he pretty much took it everywhere with him and filmed everything he possibly could.
The equivalent of getting a top of the range Apple phone or something.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know what to do with this, son. You need to look after it. But the other thing is the colour. Because I was not expecting to see colour footage from so early on in the century. So now I presume the camera wasn't a colour one, was it? That was because of the war. He was able to
he was able to get his hands on some colour film, whether in a sort of underhanded way of getting hold of it, or just being very resourceful and very clever. That his position within the Gurkhas as a surveyor, he had certain access to say he needed colour film for particular reasons, and well, I'm very grateful now that he managed to get his hands on it.
Yeah, because he was saying, well, I need this film to do my job properly.
Yeah.
But then you see all these amazing other pictures that he took. And what struck me about that was that, because it was the Indian Army, wasn't it, that he was with? Yeah. And it's often a part of the Second World War which is largely forgotten, I think.
Yes.
We think about the wars in Europe and in Asia and even Australia, I suppose, but India is often forgotten about. Yeah. And then you see this amazing footage of him with these Gurkhas, which seemed like an incredible relationship anyway.
Well, I think a big thing for Harry was, he volunteered, he signed up, he'd lost his own father during World War One, so he never even met his dad. His father passed away before he even got to meet him. So I think when he went off and volunteered, it was a huge big thing for him and his mum. But then when he got posted with the Gurkhas, he thought, wow, I've really landed quite an opportunity here. As far as he was concerned, it was the finest sort of regiment in the world to get to work with them. So I think a lot of the motivation behind capturing their training and how they worked and his relationship with them was just out of just incredible gratitude that this was the role he was being asked to play during that time.
And you should see the film for all sorts of reasons, but that footage on its own is worth viewing because there's a lot of, it's very topical at the moment with 1917 and other films, Dunkirk and things like that recently. Yeah. But to see that real footage, it's quite powerful to see, I think. Yeah. It really gives you the sense of that this isn't being acted. These are real people in real situations. Yeah. So you have this amount of footage and the diaries as well, as you say. So how do you approach then turning it into a film when people say, yeah, there could be an interest in this? You've got the director, Matt Pinder. Yes. Was that someone who you approached early on to do it?
Matt was the absolute linchpin to the whole thing coming together, and that introduction between two of us was a real synchronicity that occurred because I was kind of, like I say, I was exploring the idea of it. I was talking to some people that I knew within the industry that I'd got to meet, being introduced to other people who might be able to give me some good advice about how to go about this. And I'd met one person who was really keen to get behind the project, to sort of maybe invest and come on board as a producer. But quite quickly I felt like, I think we want to make very different films here. He was like, let's go back off to India and we'll reenact this and we'll do that. But I was like, it's not Saving Private Ryan. I was like, I think that's what you're wanting to make, and I think I want to make Cinema Paradiso. And so we were kind of going on very different trajectories. So I met Matt because I'd actually just done a film that I'd acted in up in Scotland that we'd had a bit of press about, and in one of the interviews that I did, I talked about my granddad because he was a big influence in me wanting to go into cinema in some capacity, and then shortly after I talked about him in that interview, I got contacted by Matt, and Matt at the time was doing a series for the BBC about amateur home movies in Scotland, and he had been told by quite a few people about Harry Birrell. Oh, you've got to see Harry Birrell stuff, you've got to track down Harry, and he hadn't managed to track down Harry's stuff. So when he saw me talk about my granddad Harry and he saw my name and he thought, I need to get in touch with this girl. So he got in touch with me and we met up, we had a cup of coffee, and he said, I'd love to use a bit of Harry's film for my television series. And I said, okay, that would be fine, happy to do that. But I'd be really interested talking to you about a dedicated feature documentary, all of Harry's work, really paying homage to him and exploring his work in great depth. How would you feel about that? And he said, I'd love to. I showed him a bit of the footage that I had, like a really small amount of it. Yeah. And he said, yeah, it'd be amazing. I'd love to do a feature length project at the moment. So we just, from there, I felt it was a really nice synergy coming together with Matt, and that was the sort of catalyst that was needed to then start the ball rolling and get the project going. I
love the idea that the name Harry Birrell had been kind of now whispered around places. This is the secret footage that you have to see. And it's also narrated beautifully, I think, by Richard Madden. Yeah. So, I mean, what was that the next step to get someone who... Was that the format that, when you decided it was going to be more Cinema Paradiso than Saving Private Ryan, that you were going to have a narrator use the diaries?
Yeah, so, you know, Matt quite quickly said, I want to focus a lot on the sort of wartime stuff. You know, there's such a wealth of material here. We've got to find an angle, and an angle that's particularly relevant and of interest to audiences that didn't know Harry and what's the most extraordinary stuff. So we decided a sort of decision to focus on a lot of the wartime stuff and before and after the war, and that narration would be a key part of it. And very early on, you know, so Matt and I met in 2015, right. Or maybe even 2015, and we'd sort of thrown Richard's name around between us, like really, really early on at the very start of the process.
Interesting.
Because, and at that point, Richard he was only really known for Game of Thrones, so lots of people didn't know his name yet, and we were keen on him because he was from Paisley and because he had a lovely voice, because he sounded quite like Harry, and Matt had actually done a small job with him before.
Right.
So he recorded Richard doing something shortly later also, and by this point Matt had a couple of the diaries with him, and he just had them in the room when he was doing a job with Richard, and Richard picked up the diaries and started looking at them. Oh, these are amazing, these are cool, what are they? And Matt sort of opportunistically said, oh, we're actually making this film, and we're putting together a bit of a teaser to try and raise some money for the film. I don't suppose you'd be up for, you know, reading some of them and letting me record you. And he's like, oh yeah, no worries. So there and then, whilst doing another job, Richard lent his voice to reading out a bit of the diaries. Fantastic. And then he said at that point, you know, if you guys do get this made, I'd love to narrate it. So fast forward to like last year before the film came out, and I met Richard for the first time at his premiere for Bodyguard through a completely different project I was working on, and I said to him, you're going to be way too busy now, aren't you? There's no way you're going to do my wee film. And he's like, absolutely not. Like, definitely, I'm committed, brilliant. I'm doing it. And at that point, he was doing Rocket Man, he'd just done Bodyguard, and his star had really kind of risen a lot. So I was very, very grateful that he stayed by his word and found the time to.
Because you're right, at that time when Bodyguard came out, there was no television programme spoken about more.
Yeah, no.
And he has got this. I don't think I realised when I've seen him in drama, but hearing him narrate the diaries, he has this incredible voice. Yeah,
it's a wonderful voice. I think it's one of his finest performances.
No bias at all. I like this idea of it being opportunistic, that the diaries just happen to be there.
Yeah.
Heavy inverted commas around that, opportunistic. That's brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to also, you say that it's amateur footage, and I suppose, you know, technically you can argue what amateur is. It doesn't feel like amateur footage. This is someone who, as we say, got his camera at 10 and clearly knew how to use it.
Yeah.
You know, it does feel like you wouldn't think that the guy who's in charge of the people that he's filming was doing the filming.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. It was quite exceptional footage, and I think this is why, like, when Matt first heard Harry's name, it was through a lot of the amateur filmmaking people. So there's a chap called Norman Spears who actually features very briefly in the film talking about Harry, and he ran some of the filmmaking clubs in Glasgow, and Harry had won loads of awards for his films, and I think had the war not happened, his intention would have been to go into the film industry. He was starting to write letters to studios and to production companies asking for internships and, you know, can I come and get involved? Can I come and learn a bit about how you work? And then war happened, and he just sort of thought, well, I think life's got other plans for me. And he put that whole that whole ambition to do it professionally to bed, and decided, well, you know, I'm very grateful I didn't lose my life in the war. I'm going to have family and buy a house and have a sort of stable life, which a lot of us who work in film and TV know that it's not the sort of the most obvious stable life choice.
Well, that's one of the things that struck me as I was watching it, was that how the war stopped people's lives, exactly that, or at least kind of put a hold on them, or maybe changed the idea of who they were, you know, the kind of different perspective on it. But it just strikes me now that a lot of the footage in India in particular, there's a ease with which the people are on camera. You've sometimes seen footage of war that's been done by an official photographer, and people are almost playing up to the camera and waving and all that kind of stuff, and there isn't that. It's very much people at ease with the person who's actually shooting it. It's a lovely thing. So now looking back, did it change, looking at the footage, did it change your idea of your grandfather? I'm trying to think. I had maybe a couple of pictures of my grandparents, weddings and when they were young, and it's also quite an odd thing to see, but to have this amount of footage of someone as a young man who you knew, as you say, quite briefly, but as an older, as a grandparent, it must be interesting.
I massively changed my perspective of who he was, and I'd go as far as to say changed my relationship with him as a person, because we don't often get the opportunity to get to know a grandparent, who they were in the period of life that I'm living in now. So when he was my age, who was he when he was younger? What was his life like when he was the same age as I am? And that felt incredibly personal. It felt like, wow, you're really getting to know almost like a completely different person. Sure. So you get to know your grandparent, and they're your granny or your granddad, and you forget often, and we're all guilty of it, forget they've had this whole incredible life often before we came along. And it was a real privilege to get an insight, a really deep insight into what that life was, and how it shaped who he became, how it shaped him as a parent, how it shaped the rest of us as the offspring of the family. It really gets your mind thinking about a lot of things, and how things may have been different if this had happened, if that hadn't happened, and that whole sliding doors thing. You get a perspective of maybe the trajectory his life was taking, the way the war changed that, and it definitely gave a very interesting and incredible perspective.
And it's also fantastic to have a film like this, which is not concentrating on the big figures, whether it's Churchill or Eisenhower or whoever it would be. It's actually someone who is intrinsically involved on a day-to-day level, who's not flying here, there and everywhere. And it goes for the whole thing. I mean, it made me think of the Woody Allen film Zelig, where Zelig kind of pops up in all these important pictures in time. It seems to me that there's something of that here's someone that, unless the film had been made, folk wouldn't necessarily have discovered.
Yeah.
But it's important points in time as well.
Yeah, I think I've been the people that have seen the film already. There's been a lot of very personal responses to it, and either because they say, "Oh, I had family who were in Burma, and my dad, my granddad, whatever," or because it does sort of give you an opportunity to reflect on your own life. He was just like you say, he had an fairly ordinary positioning within what was happening in the war. It wasn't, that he was some sort of highfalutin figure or anything, but he captured something that a lot of people were able to relate to if they went through that period of time. And I think that does feel quite unique, because we don't see the war from this perspective very often. Right.
Unless it's fictionalised, and then to see it in real, I think is something quite special. Yeah. Am I right in thinking he hired out the GFT at one point to show?
He did. So
a lot of the footage.
Yes, and he actually showed. So Harry made a film once he'd retired, and his favourite pastime was sort of going up to the attic and sitting in isolation and exploring the films that he's taken throughout his life and sort of chopping things together. He put a film together in the 70s called Looking Back, which was a quite sort of amateur stitching together of lots of stuff that he shot throughout his life. And I had seen Looking Back, and that was something that he'd shared with the family, but he kind of skipped a lot of the war stuff. Right. So you see him when you see life before the war, you see life when he's got a family and things, and you skip a lot of the war stuff. But he was incredibly proud of this film, and he'd had some interest. I think he had some interest from the BBC in showing his film on mainstream television. And he was extremely excited about this. But then they came back to him and they said, it's fantastic, we think your film's incredible, but it's 3.25 hours long, we'd probably have to cut it. Because we all know that getting an hour and a half on the BBC is privilege enough to, let alone getting 3 hours and a quarter. And he said, I can't possibly cut it. So anyway, they said, well, that's unfortunately we're not going to be able to show it. So he took the decision to hire out the GFT and put on this sort of very grand showing to all his friends and family. And he filled out the whole of what's now GFT 1 with friends and family, 1976. And that was actually really incredibly lovely sort of coincidence that we ended up premiering the film during Glasgow Film Festival in GFT 1, because we were originally meant to be in the other auditorium, GFT 2, and we sold out, so they put us in the bigger space, and then we filled that up as well, and then it was a really, really special thing, thinking what a cool thing that we're now premiering this film in the same auditorium, not because we've orchestrated it, just because that's how it's happening.
Kind of feeling of previous films in that room and ghosts in the room. There's a very poignant piece of narration that says, my memory is not good, and that many of the memories I have are now fading. And was there comfort for him in having the images as that was the case? Because it's quite, obviously it's a common thing, in aging population, that the memory isn't so good.
Absolutely. I think it was a comfort having that memory through his films, but as you see watching the film, that his eyesight also started to really deteriorate as he got older, and so I think that was a very big challenge for him. He could no longer really edit his films together, and it was his absolute favourite thing to do in life, was to sit and root through his old films that he'd taken and edit them and watch them and things. So that would have been a massive challenge, starting to lose his eyesight. Yeah. And
obviously you said you'd been working on the film for a while before it was shown at the film festival. How does your relationship with the film change over that period of time? You have all these hopes and ideas about what it's going to be, and when at the end, how did you feel about it?
Well, it was quite a long journey, because Matt and I met, and then we were both really ensconced in other work that we were doing. I went over to the States briefly for a year or so, doing a program over there, and Matt was working on some really pretty. Anybody that's seen any of Matt's other stuff, he's done some pretty heavy material, a lot of sort of prison related stuff and murder trials, and this was a real kind of opportunity, light relief for him. So it was something that was going on in both of our lives for really quite a long time, but it was just being fitted around other work. And when we got Hopscotch involved as well, to work as producers on the film, and John at Hopscotch came in and they really tackled a huge amount of the actual practical production work, which allowed us to be freed up and focus on a lot of the creative side of it. And Matt would just really went and immersed himself completely in Harry's world, and I think saw maybe quite a lot of himself in Harry as a filmmaker, so really felt this lovely synergy. And then by the time we actually came to the first cut of the film, it was quite special, because it had been a really long process. We hadn't had to rush really to finish it, so we just allowed it to come to fruition when it was ready. And actually it would have been 100 years. Harry would have turned 100 the year that we premiered, so that was also quite a lovely thing to think, actually it's nice finishing now in 2019, and it feels right. And
I think that's the thing, watching it feels right. It ends when it's supposed to end. Nothing about it feels rushed, and almost it has this gestation period off the 100 years from at least from when he started shooting. And I love the fact that the director of photography credit is Harry, which is a lovely touch. I mean, that it had to be. I think when Matt and I started chatting about how did we see the film come together, and we were talking about trying to locate a lot of Harry's maybe contemporaries that were still around and still alive. And when I'd started thinking about making the film,
I was thinking, right, I want to interview, you know, at the time I'd first thought about doing it, Harry's sister was still alive, and other friends of his were still alive, and they started passing away, and I started thinking, oh my God, if I don't do something now, I'm going to leave this too late, and I'm going to lose all these really crucial voices who can talk to us about who Harry was. But as we got more as we got more involved in the process, Matt said, you know, I really want Harry's work to be the star in this film. We don't want it to be too many kind of talking heads, and there's a lot of material here that we can that we can use. We don't want to kind of cut that short by doing contemporary interviews and in the modern day with people. So yeah, I think that kind of shaped a lot of how we went about it, and rather than doing lots of interviews with people, it was really about allowing Harry's work to be the star, and from that it meant he was the director of photography, because 95% of what you see in the film was shot by him.
I mean, I think that's exactly, you could have had different talking heads and it might have been interesting, but really what you want to see is more of the photography.
Absolutely.
You know, that's it. And because there was this amount of material, did you ever think you would split it into two, or was it always going to be one feature?
Well, we might still do another.
Well, I didn't want to say that. Yeah.
This project was always going to be one feature, so we never. Right. It was really important to me. Probably more for sort of personal and quite kind of nostalgic reasons, that it be seen, that it be a cinematic proposition, that it be something that could be enjoyed in a cinema, that it could be something that celebrated cinema and it celebrated film and it celebrated filmmaking, because that was such a huge part of what drove Harry and his passion for making these films, was the magic of the cinema. So that sort of 90-minute format I was quite married to that from quite early on. And that actually nobody came along and said, oh, what about doing 3 episodes? What about doing it episodically? And we were really, really lucky to be able to be supported in it being a 90-minute feature-length documentary. And that's how it's ended up, and we're really lucky that the BBC were supportive in that decision, 90 minutes, and Screen Scotland were happy with that. And yeah, it felt like I said, how it was meant to be. It was just and there's so much more footage. So although the diaries stop at the end of the war, so if we were to do stuff that explored some of his later footage, we maybe have to think about a slightly different structure, approach to it, But.
And talking about things that are meant to be, it's going to be on BBC Scotland on March the 17th. So all this time after he didn't get it on the BBC, you're managing to finally get this footage onto it. That must be fantastic.
Absolutely. The week of his birthday,
superb. Well, Carina, thank you very much for talking to us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's a lovely film.
Thank you.
So if you are watching or listening to this, it is going to be on BBC Scotland March the 17th at 10 p.m, and it'll be available on iPlayer right across the country as well, so tune in for that. And we'll be back soon with you and someone completely different. Cheers.